Father, we come to you and ask once more that you would, in faithfulness to us and in faithfulness to your Son, make clear and plain what you've written for us in your word. This book of Genesis is certainly a book of first things, elementary principles, basic truths that we need to understand and apply and incorporate into our lives, the way we think about everything that happens in the world and ourselves and you. And we pray that your word would do its work today. Help us to lay hold on its meaning and to receive your word in our hearts. Amen. Well, in one sense, you could say that we have, as of last time I spoke, gone through the entire book of Genesis. We've done it. And now we're going to do it again. And then we'll do it one more time after that before I leave Genesis. So you think, what? So what I want to do is take about, I think I say about because I might take one away or I might add one, but from starting now, 13 messages, 12 of which will go a review through Genesis more slowly, and then the last one, which will be one message where we just do the whole thing, summarize it all as quickly and as well as we can. My goal in this is not to say all the things we said before really fast, right? But to say those important things that were said already forcefully again and weave it all together for us so that we don't forget what we covered 6 years ago when we started Genesis, before all the long breaks and the marching through the text and the long expositions and all of that and the messages and things that went on. It's funny, just in my mind, I will regularly speak even in a message and say, a little bit ago when we went through this text and I realize YouTube tells me that was 5 years ago. It's like, no one remembers that, So it's that sort of a thing. I would hate to have gone through all of this, get done with Genesis 50 like we did the other week, and just move on. And it's like, but I never really got to weave this together in a way that maybe could be impactful in a more lasting way. And so that's what I hope to do these next number of messages. These 12 messages where we will kind of work through the book for the second time. We'll be over different portions of Genesis, roughly corresponding to the divisions Moses has given his book. I won't perfectly follow those divisions in terms of the messages I give and the verses they cover, but his divisions of the material with their corresponding issues that he raises will certainly govern everything that is said. There simply isn't any other way to faithfully give a review of his book than to follow his ordering and his agenda. You may remember when we began this years ago, before all this happened, that I really took pains as we started our study in Genesis to kind of clear away all the issues that we ask of Moses that he doesn't raise, try to kind of deal with some of that stuff and get them out of the way so that we could approach the text and not stop every 5 verses, especially in chapter 1, and say, now what does this mean for the current debate? But rather just hear him and follow his agenda. We have to listen to him and allow him to set the agenda. So I hope the result of all this review is that we will come away with a thorough and sound understanding of all that God is communicating to us in this glorious book, and that by dealing with this foundational book as we have, that the contents of the entire Bible will be more accessible and more meaningful to you, because at the beginning you have such a thorough understanding of what is set forth. So my job, I don't think, is complete until after we've made our way through these reviews. For us today, that means covering the first portion of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. You could turn there. And we'll end today at chapter 2 and verse 3. As we review with you this portion of Genesis, I want to consider the material under several headings. There are 7 of them. That's fitting. It was not intentionally 7, but there are 7 of them. First of all, the structure and pattern of the original creation account. Secondly, and I consider the whole structure of Genesis, that Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 is sort of a preamble to the rest of the book. A prologue to the rest of the book, kind of know these things first. The next heading, after the structure and pattern of this account, will be the preamble to the prologue, which would be verses 1 and 2. Then we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of this first creation account, why it was given, what's Moses doing, what's the argument he's making. Fourth, we'll consider the forming of the realms, or the first 3 days. Fifth, we'll consider the filling of the realms, or the days 4, 5, and 6. Sixth, we'll consider the preeminence of man. And last, the satisfaction of God and the sanctity of creation. Now, that is a lot. And I said I wasn't going to talk fast, right? So that I'm also not going to take a long, long time. Admittedly, we can only do these things in summary fashion. I can't stop to argue against differing interpretations. All of that has come before. What I'm seeking to do today is to take these important points as laid out by Moses, to remind you of them, to press them upon us all once more. So with that, let's read the passage, and then we will dive in. So I assume it's been some time since we have heard these words read aloud, and so please pay careful attention. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day, and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Okay. That's our text for today. And I want to remind you as we dive into this section about its structure and its pattern. And I'm not going to dive nearly as deeply as we did then, but just to point out a few things which are important as we go through here. First of all, we end at chapter 2 and verse 3. Within any narrative, there are certain breaks and boundaries. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're not as obvious. This is one that is often debated as to when it should end. A lot of people take it all the way down to chapter 2, verse 4, some at 2, 3. And, it matters in terms of how we understand the things that follow. The first reason we would stop at 2, 3 and understand that that's its kind of this first telling of creation ends there, and then a new one starts in chapter 2, verse 4, is because of a broader way that Genesis is structured. And that is that every one of these, the rest of the Bible, or the rest of Genesis rather, is structured with some statement that says, these are the generations of, and it tells, and the of is what's gone before, but the generations of is what proceeded from that person, what proceeded from this, what became of that. And then that ends, and the next section begins, and these are the generations of that person and what became of their descendants and what happened. And so this is how the book works. And so following that pattern then, when we come to the end of this creation account in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, and we see the glorious nature of it and how everything is just singing to God in a sense, and wonderful. We haven't lived that way, and so the question would be, well, if that's how it was created, what happened? And this question then is picked up in chapter 2, verse 3 to the end of chapter 4. Right? So this is brought up here. Well, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And it comes back into that time when God had made the earth and the heavens, when he was making that. It goes back into creation week to begin, and then starts out its story and tells what happened. And we get to chapter 5, verse 1, and it says, now this is the book of the generations of Adam. And so now we saw what happened with Adam and Eve and their descendants and kind of the mess of things that were made there. Okay, but then what? And it goes on from there. And so this is why the first reason we would want to stop in chapter 2, verse 3 and understand this as its own section. Some people might say, well, why not just read all of chapters 1 and 2 together as this one creation account? And the reason you don't is because no one reads it as a continuous narrative. It's not like these 7 days happen and then the next day God made man. There are skeptics of the Bible who will say, well, clearly this is a stupid book because you have the creation of man and then you have it again. So there was another woman that was made, and they have names for her and things like this that they've made up as see, the Bible has these different creation accounts and it doesn't know what it's doing. And that's a pretty, I would just say, I'll borrow their word, that's a pretty stupid way of reading the Bible, right? Pretty unsophisticated. And so the Bible really has for us kind of two accounts. And each different account of the creation story here is told from a different perspective, is trying to do different things, to teach different things. So this account in Genesis chapter 1 through 2:3 is not trying to teach us about the intricacies necessarily of man and God. It speaks to us about that in broad terms of what God's design for mankind was, but not about His dealings with any particular man or particular woman or any interactions that they may have had. It's speaking in grand and sweeping terms about all of creation, which was crowned with the creation of man in God's image. And so, or you might say, within creation, God made a crown, namely dominion, and He gave it to man to wear. Right? It was a lesser crown. It was a derived crown from God's own authority. And so, this is the way that Genesis 1 through 2:3 works. It's a broad, sweeping, grand, glorious telling of what God has done in creation. So, this is where we are then. I won't get into, some people want to divide it, chapter 2, verse 4 in half. I won't get into that a whole lot. There are reasons for not doing that. Why dividing it just hard at the end of chapter 2, verse 3. But there are some patterns and things within this section. Let me just give you a brief idea of what we're talking about. We're familiar, all of us, with the 7 days of creation. That's one thing we could say about a pattern. There's this marching of days. There was one day, and then there was the second day, the third day, the fourth day, and so on into day 7. This is significant and important, certainly, in terms of the questions we tend to ask Genesis, but just understand that there is this progression of days. But there is also, it's very subtle, it's not as easy to find in our English Bibles because of the way things are translated, but it is there, certainly in the original, and you can pick up on it in many ways in our English. There's a symbolical use of numbers and of repeating words. Our authors, in our culture today, don't generally ask of us to keep track of the number of times things are mentioned and how these things play off of each other. But sometimes ancient authors did. Now, this has to do with what kind of writing you're reading as well. What's the material? If you're reading a poem, you understand you've got to sit down and think a little more, be a little more careful about how the words interact, what double meanings maybe certain phrases might have or words, and how these things play off of each other. What, again, was the main topic we're talking about? You're supposed to kind of come with a lot of ideas and experience in that topic already and bring all that with you as you read and see what they're bringing out and what they're highlighting. Poems are very different than narrative, right? And what's tricky is Genesis 1 is a narrative poem in a sense. It's an artistic telling of what has happened, but it's done in such a carefully crafted way that for us as we read, we just think, okay, we're just going to start reading the Bible. But if you read in the original language, the structured nature of the text cannot be missed. And added to that, when a Hebrew reader was to read something that they could see was that structured, they knew there were some things that the author was asking of them to do, just like we know with poetry. But one of the things an ancient author was asking people to do was to pay attention to some of these numbers, and we just don't do that today. And so some of these numbers that come out are significant, and they're significant enough I want to repeat some of this again. The first verse, the first statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is exactly 7 words, 7 Hebrew words. Now, in ancient texts, the numbers 3, 5, 7, and 10 are kind of the important ones. 3, 5, 7, and 10. And you have, verse 1, 7 words. The second verse, the second statement that's made, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It's exactly 14 Hebrew words. So the first statement that's made is he makes it in 7 words. Then he makes another statement, and it's exactly 14 words. The whole creation account. And those are, that's sort of the preamble to the rest of creation, talking about the setting in which it was. So he sets up the rest of the structure using 7 words and 14 words. And it's significant. A reader of the ancient Bible would have said, this is very carefully done. I really need to pay attention here. I really need to think about every word that's used and what's being said. And so they go back and they probably read those 2 verses 4 or 5 times before they even went on to the rest of it. Really try to understand what might be being set up here to help them understand the rest of it. Whereas we just go on to verse 3 and keep going as fast as we can, and we got 5 more minutes till our Bible reading's got to be done. Kind of thing, right? And that's terrible. It's not the way it's meant to be read. The whole creation account takes place using the phrase, and this may not, I've mentioned this several times before, but you may have forgotten. 10 times there's this phrase, and God said. So there are 10 words of creation, right? Some of the kids might remember this when we spoke in the older kids study about the temple and all of this. When this was being set up, it was set up with 10 words from God to how they were going to arrange the temple and build it. 10 times it said in Exodus, and God said. We also have 10 commandments, 10 words from God that are His law. And here are 10 words from God about creation. So there's this pattern, and it's 10. Why only 10? Didn't He make anything else? There are some things that are left out in all of this. He did. But Moses isn't concerned with that. He wants to tell it a certain way, and he gives 10 things. And God said, and God said, and God said. 10 words from God. 10 words of creation. There are 7 days in the narrative. And we look at that and might say, well, there's 7 days in a week. But most of those other cultures didn't have 7 days in a week. The Jews did because they followed this account. And they had 7 days in their week. They weren't the only ones, but there were many who did not have 7 days in a week. 7 times we read, and it was so. That's interesting, isn't it? If there's 10 times God said, you think there'd be 10 times and it was so. But no, it's just 7 times, and it was so. 7 times we read that God evaluated His creation as good. On the 7th time that He evaluates it as good, it's very good. Right? Significant. 20 times, 10 and 10. Heaven is mentioned. 21 times, 7. And we look at that and think, really? 7 times 3. 3 sevens. Earth is mentioned. 35 times, 7 and 5. 2 significant numbers. Again, God is mentioned. There are 3 times in the account God blesses. He blesses the fish and the sea and the birds. And He blesses mankind, and He blesses the 7th day. And you think, well, why didn't He bless the animals and the livestock and stuff? Well, we're meant to assume that He did, but it's left out so that this number 3 can be an emphasis on that 3rd time. The 3rd blessing is on the 7th day. On 3 occasions of when man is created, 3 times we read, and God said, and God said, and God said. 3 times when man is created, we read God created, He created, He created. And that even in itself, within the highly structured account of Genesis 1, that in itself is actually a poem that God created man. It's poetic. Even that part is even more structured. It's amazing. The 7th day of creation breaks this pattern of days. It's a little different than the rest. There's no creation evaluation, and then concluding summary of the day. Rather, there is finishing, ceasing, blessing, sanctifying. It's totally different. It seems strange. The seventh day has a total of exactly 35 Hebrew words in it. That is 7 times 5. Exactly 7 times 5. The 3 clauses, there are 3 statements in the middle of these verses. They have 7 words each. And each of those 3 clauses that have 7 words has the word in it, 7. The word 7 is there. Right? And on the 7th day, God finished all His work that He had done. And He rested on the 7th day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. It's just, for us, we just read it and think, okay, I don't know why it's telling me those things all the time. It's kind of, and it's kind of being repetitive. But for Moses, it's a stylistic repetition. It's not unnecessary. It serves a point to highlight how important this is for us. As English readers of our Bible, we can get that as we read this structured setting by a faithful translation. We have those faithful translations. We're reading them, one of them. And Moses, the reason we can still get the right emphasis is because Moses isn't depending upon the numbers alone for us to get the emphasis and what's important. But knowing the numbers will help you not miss it. Right? He's trying to write in a way that's beautiful and amazing and grips us, but also that even a child or someone who's just barely familiar with what's required of them when they read stuff like this, they couldn't miss it. So that if you weren't sophisticated enough to get the subtle hints of what's said, you would see the bold, highlight, and underline parts that are repeated, and you'd say, but wait a minute, I do need to really pay attention here. This is the main thing. And so that's the way this whole structure of Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 works. Now, if all that is said, one thing we can say from all these numbers, a couple things we could say, but one of them we would say is whatever happens in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, is kind of the big thing. Everything kind of leading up to that. Now, what else can we know maybe from the structure? I mentioned about the importance of verses 1 and 2, and how that kind of sets us up for all that follows. Well, let's look. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Let me give you what I did years ago, an interpretive translation of that verse. So this is me trying to say everything that's in the verse, but in a different language that will be more obvious to understand. And then we'll go through and we'll explain some of what's said. In the beginning of everything outside of God's person, in the beginning of all that we know and sense and imagine, was God's action of creation. He created everything from the highest and loftiest unseen spiritual heavens even to the lowest and basest parts of our physical world. Having done that, however, this earthly realm, this physical realm, was from this first instance, or at this moment, in this beginning, was without form and without filling. Darkness was over the face of the deep. And in that condition, God's Spirit was brooding over the face of the waters. Now, in the beginning, not the beginning of God, He had no beginning. He's from everlasting to everlasting. Right? Think of a line that stretches forever in both directions. Mathematically, we have that, right? We have a line segment, which is what we usually think of when we think of a line. Draw a line on this paper, and you think, that's impossible, right? Technically, like I cannot draw a line on this paper. The paper has stopping points, right? So we put an arrow that way and an arrow that way. This is God, right? At some point along God's line, a new line begins when God creates. And this is the line of creation's existence. That is a ray. It has a definite starting point, but continues off in a direction indefinitely, right? Without end. The verse is telling us what happened at that first moment when that ray, that new ray, began. It's not saying anything about God in terms of when He began, but the beginning of what we know. Our line started there, at the beginning of our line. Okay? It originated with God's act. This word used for God in this text, in this chapter, is the word Elohim, and speaks to the fullness of His deity, His authority, His power. This same word is used elsewhere in the Bible for other people, such as kings, angels, judges. It can also at times be meant even just as a superlative meaning for greatness, like the one who's great, who's greatly great, right? We watched a movie not long ago about some orphans in Texas that had a football team. It was pretty good. And there were only 12 of them on a football team. They all went both ways and played multiple positions. But they were called, because they were so small, because they were orphans back then and they weren't fed well. They were tiny, and they were called the Mighty Mites. And like mites meaning like little, but you might think the Mighty Mites, like we're mighty and we're mighty. It's like kind of a repetitive thing, right? If you hear it wrong. I kept thinking of that, the kind of the dual meaning there, all the way through the movie. But God He's the great, great one, right? The one who's greatly great. This is the word that's used here. It's not like a proper name for God. It's just a name that, if you really think about what it means as a name, the one who's supremely great, well, yeah, I guess that would only really properly belong to God. Even though you might have certain men in the world who call themselves by that name. It's just like we have a thing, there have been men in history who call themselves, we're King of Kings. But we know as Christians that that's a loaded phrase. King of Kings, that's Jesus. There's only one King of Kings. And yet, there have been men who politically have been positioned where they were in fact King of Kings. But not in the truest sense, right? Not in a sense like Jesus is. They couldn't compare to Him. He's King of Kings in a way that they never could be. God is Elohim, the great, great one, in ways that nothing else is. And let's see, tell me about this great, great one in the beginning. Well, what He did was He just started speaking, and everything just happened. That's how great He is. So it's incredible. In the beginning, He created the heavens and the earth, and that earth was without form, and it was void. There are some problems about this earth, the heavens and the earth, when He created them. The heavens were created, the unseen realm, that's fine and dandy. But the earth itself, what about that? It was without form and void. The earthly realm, all that we know in our physical existence, was just there. There was just darkness upon it. This is terrifying to us. When you think about what this would be like, everything, every form, function, everything you can imagine in your mind's eye didn't exist. The only thing that you might be able to say, oh, I know what that's like, is the deep, something like the vast ocean. If someone were to drop you off in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, this is something like all of created existence. It's just stuff. It's just, there's nothing there. It's just things, the material is there. But you wouldn't, and the only way you could recognize the deep, though, and know that you were really in this place is if you could see, if there was light. But it's all dark. Darkness was also over the face of the deep. These words that are used, without form and void, govern the rest of the story. And if you were reading carefully, you'd see it's without form and it's void. But those words in Hebrew rhyme. Tohu, bohu. And you think, why does he use these? The earth was tohu and bohu. And you think, well, why you say it that way? There's other words to use. Because he's going to use those words to structure the rest of the text. It was without form. There was no substance. There was no realm. It wasn't formed into anything. And then there was void. There was no occupants. Nothing to occupy it. It was just there. And then it was darkness was over the face of the deep. Everything that we recognize as necessary for life was absent there. Just gone. And so it's sort of like, have you ever, I don't know, maybe this is just me, I don't know. It's not just me because there's videos on it, so other people care about it too. But like, people talk about like what would happen if you were just like let loose in space. Anybody ever think about that? Like, you think, I used to always think, oh, like you die because you don't have oxygen. And it's like, no, like you died long before that. the lack of pressure in space, so it's like you instantly boil. You're done. It's just, right? Everything, you just cease to exist almost. You're gone. Your body, all your cells just destroyed like that. And I think, how could that even, it's like terrifying. Like you would not want, no, under no circumstances is that okay. There's no way to survive. There's not like, well, maybe you could make it. Like you just won't. You'll never make it. And this is what it's like. In the beginning, God created this. And it's staggering to think that it's not that God was willing to leave things this way. It's amazing to think that God could conceive of a creation that was like this. He created the heavens and the earth was in this condition. And you and I could never live like this. It's a threat to us. Everything about us would end if we were to be there, transported to there at that time. But not God. God draws near and hovers over the face of the waters. He's getting ready to do something. And so we're as we read, the pump is primed for us to see God as He's about to act. He's brooding over the face of the waters. Right? He draws near, and you could imagine, we don't know if anything happened because it doesn't tell us anything happened to the waters at this point, which was all that there was. But you just wonder if they began to stir and to boil and to whatever. You just think here he comes, and he's brooding. What does that mean when a bird broods over their young? Right? They gather them all up, and they maybe have something to tell them, but they take care of them. They're all under the feathers there, and they're gathered together and protected, and something is done. Some intentional act is done. And this is the way God is. God comes, He's got it all made up, but it's nothing like He wants. It's just like all the raw materials. It would be like a potter getting a big shipment of clay in and putting it inside his art room, or his his studio where he works, and it's all there. And now what does he do? Now he comes over and he grabs some of it and he sets it on this turning wheel, right? And it's like, okay. He's getting ready. Hadn't done anything really yet, but something's about to happen. And this is how this text begins. And so this is the way it is. Now, okay. So verse 3. We begin now the forming of the realms. Also, I want to say this entire creation account, this is important to say, is written in phenomenological language. What the heck does that mean? Phenomenological language. Phenomenon is something like that happens, right? It's just some event that happens. You don't know how to explain it. You're just describing what happened, what you saw. And the idea is picture someone on the face of the waters and what eventually becomes the face of the earth itself, describing how these things may have looked. The idea is man who until then, and certainly really basically until now, has only ever lived its time on the surface of the dry ground. This is kind of how we live. We live in this way. Human society, as you could say, well, I was on a boat, for a month. Okay, and then how about the entire rest of your life? Where did you live, right? You live here on the ground. Well, I've flown, yes. And outside of those 3 hours, where have you lived? It's this kind of thing. This is where we live. We make our home on the earth, the dry ground. Standing here, how might this have looked? How might this have happened? What would you say about it? And it's not that it's saying that there always was this vantage point for which you could stand, but rather the beginning takes place. The Spirit of God is over the face of the waters, and you're kind of meant to be there seeing it with Him, right? Kind of over the surface of things. And then all of a sudden these things begin to happen. And so this is where we are. It's just describing these things as they would have appeared had you been there. On day one, we see God making light by direct speech. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Right? He creates here. It doesn't say He created. It just says it's inferred. Right? God said, "Let there be light," and light was. And then He evaluated, and God saw that the light was good. And then God did something else that day. We don't know how He did it. He didn't speak it though, or maybe He did, but it doesn't tell us. And then God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. This is, right? So, and we looked at these a long time ago. When it starts out, the Jews described their days, they counted their days starting at nighttime. When the sun set, that's when the day began. So there was evening, and there was morning, day 1. Evening, morning, day 2. That's how these cycles work in Genesis 1. So it's not saying these things all happened like during the day, and then there was evening, and then it came to morning, and that was day 1. And then God did all these things, and then there was an evening, and there was a morning, that was day 2. Rather, each day begins with disorder. It's this watery chaos almost to begin with. It's this watery, it's formless, it's void, there's nothing there. And it begins in that way. There's the evening and morning, and then God sets out to do His work, and He changes it, and then the day's over. And then you have this condition again, and then God does His work, and the day's over. And so God every day is taking things and adding more order. He's intensifying the complexity and the order of this creation throughout in this beginning time. Now then, and God said, "Let there be." So the next day then begins with another this next way, right? He says, "Well, let me say this." God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and there was evening, there was morning, the first day. So again, day here means what? Not 24-hour day, it means a 12-hour day. It means the time of light. That's what these days mean. There was evening, there was morning in the first day, evening and morning the second day, right? Day, He just said, He called the light day, and the darkness He called night. So that's, and how did that day begin? Well, you had darkness, and then God created light. And then He separated them into those eternal categories, day and night. And God said, day 2, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. There was evening and there was morning, and the second day." All of this is presented to us as we march through these days as a craftsman going about his craft, his work week. And God begins on the first day, and He goes to work, and He speaks. Now, He works differently than you or I do. He didn't bring His tools with Him, but here He is, and He works, right? And then you have the nighttime, and nothing really is happening there, evening and morning, and then the next day, and He did all this work. And this is the way it works. He works, the creation kind of is happening. The idea is it's happening here in the daytime, now that there's day. So, what does He do in this second day? He makes an expanse to separate the waters into 2 bodies. Waters above the expanse and below the expanse. And He named the expanse heaven or sky. Essentially, this provides an atmosphere and the expanse above us with rain clouds and wind and sky and all of that. Just, you know what? There's water down here on the earth, and there's water up there. And that's what God made that second day. He made however He did it, and all the intricacies that were involved, He made this expanse. Why is there stuff up there and not all is down here? Well, because God put it up there. He put this gap. And this isn't saying that there's a bunch of stuff up here and a bunch of stuff down here, and in between is just a vacuum. But rather what God made was this expanse, and He made it so that in this expanse up here would be water. That's what He did. He says, and again it says, and God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. But you remember in verse 4, about day 1, it said God saw that the light was good. But this second day, it doesn't say anything about God seeing it was good. This has to do again with this pattern. It's not that there's something wrong with this day. It has to do with this pattern of how many times good and blessing and things are going to be used. So there's a general pattern to the way the days are spelled out and narrated for us, but there are subtleties so that if you're picking up for when things are said, the emphasis is all on the certain points that He wants to make. Now, day 3. What do we read? Day 3 of the work week, we see God gathers up and separates the waters into their place, and the dry land appears. He named the dry land earth, and the waters he named the seas, right? So let's just read that. Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. It's not that all the waters were gathered together into one specific place, but that they were gathered together as one, right? This heaped together here, and these are heaped together over here, and these are heaped together over here. And we know that because it says, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. Plural. There's a sea here, there's a sea there, there's a sea here, there's a great big sea here. We call that an ocean. There's a smaller sea over here. We call that a pond. There's a little one over here. They call that a lake. This one we call the sea. We have different, but these things were gathered together, and the dry land appeared. Those are listed as two separate things. Physically, I'm not sure if we could say that they're two separate and distinct things, or if they're just one thing that happened. But God can create how he wants to create. And we weren't there, but we know these two things happened. The waters were gathered up into their places, specifically on the earth, where those would be, and dry land appeared. And God saw that it was good. So God speaks, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it just happened. Right? On the second day, God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. And it didn't say, and it happened. It rather said, and God made the expanse and separated the waters from above from below. How did he make it? Maybe he made it just by speaking. Maybe he spoke it and then did something. We don't know. But in verse 9, he just speaks and it just happens. And then God identifies these things. This is earth and this is seas. Right? And so, what else do we read on this same day? Because let's see this. And God saw that it was good. And God said, this is still the same day now, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so, and the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. The third day. God commands the earth to bring forth vegetation. This is an interesting thing. God didn't say, let there be vegetation. He said, let the earth sprout vegetation. Let the earth bring it forth. Right? And what do we have in verse 12? At the end of verse 11, and it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation. The earth brought it forth. Okay. Don't know how. Right? Don't know how that happened, but God said, let the earth do that, and the earth did so. Here was a command to the earth, let the earth do this, and the earth said, yes, God. Right? It's amazing. That's not what happened with light. That's not what happened with this expanse. It's not what happened when he separated the water. It didn't say, let the earth divide itself with dry land and sea. He did that, but here he commands the earth to sprout forth vegetation, and it does so. It's really remarkable. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, and then the third day. We notice for 3 days God was forming this earthly realm. He was establishing the forms it would take by speaking, by making, by commanding. 3 different ways. In each day, God separates and divides and distinguishes some part of the physical world he has made. Right? In the first day, he separates light and darkness. Right? He creates light and separates the light and darkness. In the second day, he separates the waters above and the waters below and creates this expanse. In the third day, right, he separates the dry land from the sea. Right? Separates and distinguishes. And then he puts on there this vegetation. And that's just part of that realm. He's been preparing these things as he separates. So just imagine the first thing, like here's this potter, and he gets down on that, and he puts this stack of mud on his wheel, and he starts turning it, and you see he starts going, the first thing he does, he takes this big section over here off, and then he takes that section over there off, then he elevates it real high maybe, and then it's like, it's like very broad things. He's not really doing anything intricate yet. He's just big sweeping things. And this is what God is doing. He sets, these first 3 days he's just separating things out. And then that third day, he separated some things out, and he started to make this land the way he wants that, and do that a little bit with these trees and things and the vegetation. He's put that on there. And that's really it so far. He's exercising his dominion over his creation. He's naming it. He's establishing it for all time. He sees that it's good. He evaluates it. All these things happen. The cosmic waters obey God's every will and decree just as he acts upon them, like a craftsman would do to a piece of clay or bronze. From days 1 through 3, so much of what we need and enjoy and identify as contributing to our quality of life in these realms is brought in on these days. We see light in the day-night cycle. We see the sky and the rain clouds. We see the dry land appearing and being established. We see plants that we so need for food and nourishment. All of this comes in. Also, I won't turn there, but in Psalm 136, this is important to help us know if we're reading this rightly, describes these activities of God on these days, not just as things that God was doing, but actions of love and faithfulness by God to us. Like God was loving and faithful to us in creating a world like this. In other words, you might say God had in mind in creation from the very beginning, from before the foundation of the world, creatures like you and I. And part of the creatures like you and I, in order to exist and function like He wants us to exist and function in the world, requires a world like He is here making. And it's loving and faithful for God to do these things in the way that He's doing them. He's not setting us up in a world, as originally created by Him, that would be hard and awful and terrible for our existence, but one that would be pleasant and good. One in which an Eden could exist. Right? In the garden of God. This is a world in which those things can happen. Also notice that so far God is the only actor. He's the designer, He's the builder, He's the observer and the evaluator. It's not as though He's in a class as a potter learning to do this thing and some teacher is observing and grading his work. No. He has in mind what to do. He's the only craftsman that exists. There's not even a craft or anything to be crafted, but he creates this stuff into existence, and then He begins in day 1 to shape it and fashion it, and He looks at what He's done and said, yep, that's exactly what I wanted to do. That's good. He's the evaluator. His is the purpose and the plan. No one else knows what He's making yet. His is the good by which all things are being measured. And then He begins in days 4 through 6 to fill this realm. These 3 days. He has prepared the forms, but now He's going to fulfill these realms with ruling bodies, with animate life to rule and to populate their respective spheres. On day 4, what does He do? He hangs the lights in the expanse. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. So He hangs the lights in the expanse. He creates the lights and hangs them, puts them where they go. And while they do not have the breath of life in them, and they are not any sort of personality or living being, they do move across the day and the night realm with precision, with authority, as God says, to rule over the day and over the night, to give light upon the earth, and to function for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. So they have they have a dominion, they have a charge been given to them, they have a purpose and a function, and they serve man as well by giving, if you pay careful attention, for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. The stars are just mentioned just kind of as an add-on. Oh, and the stars, He made those too. And it's the only thing I'll point out there, if you were to read other ancient accounts of the creation of the stars, you would see you have chapter upon chapter and text upon text about all the stars and their names and this and that and all these things. And here it's just, yeah, it's stars and moving on. And it's like, they're so unimportant. They're so not a factor in what happens in the rest of creation. They serve so little purpose, they have so little effect on the way your life is governed, in the sense that we don't look to these things. Yes, they rule the day and they rule the night, but they don't rule you. They don't rule God's creation or God's creatures or humanity. They serve humanity. They're consistent. The way that they govern the day and the night allows us to use them for signs, right? For seasons, for days, and for years. We can figure all of that out because they're faithfully governing the day and the night, but they don't govern us. All right, now day 5. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the 5th day. Far from the ocean or the deep, containing, as it were, the great enemies of God. These were populated, these were specifically said to be created, it says, by Him, and to be evaluated by Him as good. They're not the enemy. These are good things. On day 5, God makes a very new sort of creation, when animate life appears by His command in the waters and in the sky. Every kind of bird and every great sea creature and all swarms with which the waters swarm are made by God in order to fill their realms. In order to accomplish the abundance with which God intends for these realms to be filled by them, He blesses them, saying that they may be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea, and let birds multiply on the earth. This blessing is not a command given to them, but a blessing spoken over them. It's a blessing spoken over them. In other words, these creatures are blessed of God to fill these realms the way they do. Apart from that blessing, they wouldn't fill them this way. There wouldn't be an abundance of them. But God has blessed them that they might fill it. Over the creatures, like an umbrella, is this blessing of God to them, so that they should thrive in the sea and in the sky. He means for them to swarm with swarms and fly over the earth and across the expanse, and He will bless them to make it happen. Now then, day 6, right? Verse 24, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." Right? So God said, "Let the earth again bring forth living creatures according to their kinds," and He describes them. He says, yep, and that's what happened. God made them just that way. And God saw that, what He made, and He said it was good. Or He saw that it was good. Step by step, creature by creature, God's creation is becoming more complex, more ordered, more remarkable. And for the 6th time in our story, we read the words, "And it was so." And God steps back again, as it were, observe His work. To observe His work, He evaluates it according to His good intentions and His expert eye. He concludes that His work in the animal kingdom is just what He had set out to do in that realm. All the kinds are as He would have them to be. He saw that it was all very good. Notice that evaluation, that this day 6, even though day 6 includes the animals and the creation of man, which follows, day 6 has 2 evaluations. God made all the animal kingdom. It evaluated and said, that's good. And then God did something else on that day. something else that's distinct. And for that, we turn to our next kind of one of the last headings for the message today, the preeminence of man, the uniqueness of man. Look at verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." The only other thing so far that's said to rule is, you might say, God, but then other than that is the sun and the moon, which rule over the day and the night. But now we're given, he's going to make a creature, something that's like him in his image, and it's going to have dominion over other creatures that were just made, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. I mean, he's saying he's getting ready to make something. All that he's just made and said is very good. He's going to make something and give that something all the other somethings that he's made. It's like, it's staggering. I'm going to let you govern it all. Think, how is this possible? Well, this one's going to be different than those, because this one's going to be made in his image, in his likeness. It's going to be like he is. And it's going to have dominion over all of these things. What a thing. God deliberates within himself. Let us do this. He's not asking the angels, he's not asking anything in created order, but a deliberation within God. The divine craftsman uses the utmost care and precision and deliberation. You might think, again, here's that guy making the clay pot, and he's got it on the spinning wheel, and all of a sudden he's going like crazy. Everything's good. He steps back, like, yeah, it's good, and he does a little bit more, and he steps back and really looks at it. It's good. Goes back to work again. This time he steps back and says, "That's good." And he sits down and he goes, "Oh." And he just sits for a while. And that's what happens. God said, "Let us make man in our image." And he's deliberating. You know, let's do something unexpected here. This isn't really just like everything else we've been doing. This one's going to be different. I'm going to make this one's going to be unique. What I'm getting ready to do, there's nothing been like it before. It's going to be different in all these ways. It's going to look like me. Like, what? It's a pot. It can't be like you. We're people. We can't be like God. Well, except that God can make us like him in certain ways. And so it begins. This is that crowning moment of his creation. He's putting his own image in the piece, in his own likeness. The painter puts himself in there, right? The movie maker has a spot where he's in it, right? Except usually that's not the lead role. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the lead actor will also be the director or something, but it's like, this is the way it is. This is going to be in my image, and it's going to govern everything just the way I want it to be. And it's amazing what happens here. So man is unique. He's made in a unique pattern, after God's image and God's likeness. Nothing else in creation even hints at that. Unique purpose for him. He has dominion over everything. The only position that the image of God could have in the world is ruler, surely. As God's image, he's set in God's realm. And there he is to emulate God's rule on the earth, to steward the earth, to subdue it, in the priestly task of establishing a worshipful dominion across the entire earthly realm that's under his charge. Let's read verse 28. And God blessed, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." What a thing. Man is unique. In other literature of the time, other creation accounts and things like that, humanity is at the bottom of the heap, with the gods ruling over them harshly, making them work for the gods by providing the gods with food. But in this account, humanity has jurisdiction from God over creation as a result of being made in the image of God, as a result of being distinct and unique in creation, not the bottom of creation. Man is to be overseer of the rest of God's creation. He's to subdue it and bring an order to God's world. He's made with the capacities to carry out this design. He's made in such a way as to know and understand His Creator, to have relationship with His Creator, to communicate those things that he learns by his own behavior and by his attitudes and his dealings with the world that God has placed him in. He is here as God's image. What sort of ruler will he be? He is to do it. He is to rule the world as reflecting the image of God in the world. He does not do this from a position of strength which he does not possess, but with rather an authority that is delegated to him in his devotion to God. He walks lockstep with God as he carries out God's will in this world that he was blessed to perform. It's a priestly occupation. He's there as God's steward, as God's priest in the world to bring further order to the world, like God would have continued to do had God been in man's position. Animals are under his dominion. The earth is under his dominion. Everything is under his dominion. Man was created male and female and was given this amazing blessing. Here, the difference in the blessing, it's just amazing. And God blessed them. Elsewhere it says, in other places, look at verse 22, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas and let the birds multiply on the earth. It's like the birds are just let the birds multiply. Here he just says, be fruitful, multiply, fill those waters and the seas. But here in chapter 1 with man, and God said explicitly to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish. He's speaking directly to them. Verse 29, and God said, behold, I have given you. It's so interpersonal between them and God. This is incredibly unique. It's radically different. Nothing like this has happened. Man is unique in his relationship with God. He speaks to them, not about them. It involves communication and thought and language and relationship. What else does he say? And to every beast of the earth and to every bird of the heavens and everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. Why tell them that? Because those creatures are under their charge. And God said, I've given all these green plants for food for you. Okay, they're ours. What about these creatures? They're eating our stuff. Well, they can have it, but it's in your care. They are in your care. The food is in your care. The earth is in your care. It's all your responsibility. Go out and subdue it. Have dominion. Right? And it was so. Verse 31, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. There was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Very good. It's crowned in this way. Now it is very, very good. Very good. Man is made in the image of God, and it's very good. Oh, I wish we had time to go into all some at least of what that means to be the image of God. Right? I've got like a page and a half of super condensed notes that I had hoped to go that I'm just like, we're not going to go over that. We're just going to go on to some other things that I have because there's not time. So that's the sixth day. And it's all very good. Everything has been good. Now it's to the point where it's very good. And this is just the superlative of this. It is exceedingly good. This part of it was good. That part of it was good. That part of it was good. He got to the place where he said, okay, now I'm going to put my image in there and I'm going to have it exercise dominion and rule and reign. And it's just such an unexpected turn. And he does that and he gets done with it all and he speaks and he blesses it so that it can function the way he wants it to function. And he sits back and he says, that is exactly what I wanted to do. The whole thing, it's perfect. It's exactly what I wanted. And chapter 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And you think, okay, that's the end of the story. But it doesn't end there. And on the seventh day, there's another day here we need to still pay attention to. And this is these three verses, those 35 Hebrew words, these three middle clauses, 7, 7, and 7 words each. And each of those three clauses with 7 words has the word 7 and 7 and 7. This is like the whole culmination of it all, right? And we could get that if we read carefully, and we will. On the seventh day, God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that He had done in creation. He made it holy. He set it apart unto Himself. That's key. He blessed this thing and made it holy, set it apart to Him. What do we want to say? There are 7 days of the creation account. That's obvious, but it has profound implications for what we do as we read. Think of this. Whatever God, we know God was finished. He was finished with the creative work. But He's not finished with His work, His week of creation yet. There's still more days here to be described. Which means then that the goal of God's creative work was not to create everything. Think of that. The goal wasn't to make it all just a certain way. He did that. It was very good. And that was perfect. Everything was made just so. But that's still not the purpose and the goal and the aim for which He created it. Right? When you build a house and you've finished every detail exactly right, the builder doesn't say, okay, we can tear it down now, we did it. Or he doesn't say, leave it, it's perfect. Right? And throw the key away and let no one ever live there. It was made so He could inhabit it, or He could sell it to someone who would inhabit it, right? According to their specific designs. And He carried it out, if He's a master craftsman, without problem, right? And this is the way it is. God made everything. He had a design. He started making it. There was a pattern. There was a logic to it. He'd prepared for it. He'd done it all. He'd carried it all out. He'd evaluated it. It's very good. Now, what will be done with this creation? To what purpose did He create? That's what day 7 is all about. This is why it was made. The purpose for creation. We can talk about the fact of His creation and the sovereign, powerful way in which He did it and the amazing things that He brought about and how wonderful it is, but why does it all here? What's the point and purpose? Day 7 tells us. The climax of the creation account is the 7th day. The goal, the aim, the purpose is to arrive at what happens here on the 7th day when God takes His rest in the midst of His creation and it's all consecrated to Him. Like a builder who builds a great, magnificent hall and then decides he's going to live there and spend his time there, enjoying what He's made, this is what God does. He inhabits it. The culmination of creation is not man, but rather God's satisfaction in the whole creative order that He's made, of which man is a key part. Yes, mankind is made in the image of God, and the overall creative work is not very good until that creative work has been crowned with the creature made in God's image. But that's not the end of the creation week. The narrative moves on to a further activity of God. The narration does not allow us to take our eyes off of God. The narration continues on to the 7th and the climactic day, where we find the climax of the whole account. We could say it this way: creation is only properly ordered when it's oriented toward God, and when God inhabits His creation, taking rest in its midst. We noticed again and again in the creation account that things were oriented toward man, right? They were made in such ways to serve as signs and seasons for man, to give light to man. They were food for man. There was dry land for man. The seas were gathered up in their places so that man would have this place to be, right? There's day and there's night, and that serves man. There's all these things that serve men. The creatures themselves are just categorized as wild beasts of the field or livestock. And it's like, well, why would you call it livestock? Because men treat it that way. That's why it's called livestock. Broad categories that serve men. You know, plants that have their seed out, that blow out and just are scattered around, or plants that have their seeds inside the fruit. We can eat all of these things. It's all described in terms of how it relates to man, and yet we're not allowed to take our eyes off of God because it all connects to God. Everything is on this day as a whole brought unto God for His enjoyment, for His rest, and then it is finished. It's all been made, but it's not functioning as it should until God inhabits the place where the narrative is complete. It's not that God does anything more on this day, that he does more work. Rather, it is that he stops and he consecrates the time to himself. Now that everything has been made and it's very good, he settles down and rests in what he has made. And this is the aim of the whole account. Remember the plot, and we'll summarize things here and finish up. The heavens and the earth are made by God, but the earth is not yet formed and filled. It's a barren and disorderly state that's unsuited for the work God intends to accomplish. It's not yet in accord with his good will. The earth is unformed, it's unfilled, darkness is over the face of its waters. But the Spirit of God is brooding over the surface of the waters, which anticipates God's activity in the development of the plot. Having drawn near to the earthly realm in powerful manifestation, God orders and populates his creation according to his good will. The solution to an earthly realm not in full accord with God's plan and his will is not to enlist the help of other gods or to conquer other gods who had opposed him in some way, but rather the effortless imposition of his creative will. Just declare these things by fiat. Throughout the creation days, we witness wise and powerful edicts of God who creates out of nothing, who establishes and upholds by his powerful word. God's intention to express his loving and good character is underway in the formation of a world that expresses his power and his wisdom in its design. It serves every need that the creatures have that fill it. But also this loving and good character is seen most clearly in God's blessing upon humankind and the remarkable privilege given to mankind in his making. God did shower mankind with blessings and honors, Psalm 8. Throughout the entire plot development, it's abundantly clear that this is a sacred story, a sacred creation, all being designed and established and upheld by God for his good and sacred purposes. No one and no thing is made to have its existence in the far-off corner of his creation. It's all enjoyed by him, it's present before him, it's evaluated, it's thus sacred. Once established, it's all judged by him to be very good. And then, to resolve this whole plot of now that he's made, what does he do? Instead of his activity being creative work, it's now restful satisfaction. It's enjoyment. He sets apart these freshly obtained circumstances as sacred, both to him and to mankind. He ceased his work of creation. He judged it very good. He is now satisfied. He takes his creation into a condition of service to him, occupation to him, blessedness with him, enjoyment with him. That's the resolution. God made the heavens and the earth. The earthly realm was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. It needed more work, and God's the one to do it. He has a plan and a purpose in mind that will satisfy him, and he accomplishes all of his will in a sovereign, in an orderly, and a masterful way. Once he completes the work, he stops his craftsmanship, he rests in his finished labors, he consecrates everything to himself, and provides it all with a state of blessedness and satisfaction. It's incredible, the emphasis here that the Bible provides on this day. Now, God rests on this day. We know that when sin enters, God goes back to work. Right? He goes back to work. Which is why Jesus can say, after sin entered, and this world was marred by disobedience to God, he says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. But in this moment, when God rests from his work, it's such an amazing thing. It's like he doesn't have to work in the sense that what do you and I know as work? It's this thing you endure. Things aren't right. You have to fix them. You have to do all this stuff to get them as they should be. And God did that for these days, and then he rested from it. He didn't have to do that anymore at all. And then man came in and sinned, and sin entered, and God goes back to work, patiently bearing with sinners and sin and the destruction of his world and all that he's made, committed to it, but having to work to bring it about, not because the work is so hard, it's painful to him, surely. It's not difficult in the sense that it tests his abilities, but it tests his patience. It tests his purpose, it tests his resolve, and God brings it about in this long fashion to restore everything. And God will one day rest again, and we'll rest with him. When we think of creation, we have to think of, in this storyline, of God coming in, having made a formless and a void creation, and coming in and ordering it, setting it all up, designing it, the realms, what everything will be like, how this world will physically be, and then filling it with all these creatures that he wants to populate it, crowning it with humankind, to rule and to reign in his stead, in relationship with him. And all of this is such a joy to God, right? We have scriptures where we hear the angels are singing. There's joy in the world as God is making these things, as they're witnessing all of this. God makes it, he inhabits it, and it's perfect. Humanity and the whole created order is perfectly satisfied. They have every good thing, and God himself is satisfied in this. So what goes wrong when we're set up then to see what happens in these later chapters when sin enters, not primarily as, oh, that's how our lives were messed up, but rather to see it as God's creation was destroyed and God was robbed of the joy that he set out to enjoy, right? He created this thing and it was just what he made, and he sat in there and he consecrated unto himself, and he rested from everything that he'd done, and he blessed it all, and it was wonderful. And we've robbed God of that when we've sinned. We've marred the whole thing. We've offended him in such a way that he actually destroys people. Now, it's incredible, the offense, all that's gone wrong in the world. But as made, this is the story we're supposed to have. We're to be committed to this. This is to shape our thinking about things. Everything in your life, it's not just enough to, you've got this problem and you start figuring out how to solve it. It's like you've got to take that back and orient this thing back to God, because it's just part of this thing that he's made, this created order. And you're a creature meant to be his image in this. So in your dealings with it, it's not just what can I figure out, what thoughts do I have about how to solve my problem, but rather how might, of those options given to me, which ones might God want me to choose? Which one would reflect the character of God? How might God be honored and enjoy this decision I make or the way I tackle this problem? It all has its everything's back to God. And of course, the world we live in now isn't the same world that we see at this point. And we would all ask the question, that doesn't seem to be the world that I know. There are things that I experience in the world that I see here. I see the things that were made, but the way and the condition in which everything is just great, that doesn't seem to be our experience, what went wrong. And that's what Moses takes up in the next section. But for now, just embrace this truth. This is the narrative that undergirds the whole rest of the Bible. The way that all these things were made for God, for his enjoyment. Yes, God is kind and gracious, and loving kindness is demonstrated in all that he's made to us. It's wonderful. He doesn't want to be the only one that's joyful. But the purpose of all of this was not just to make it all. The purpose of all this was to have it consecrated to God and for his delight. Well, that is, as best I can do, an hour and 15, 20-minute review of Genesis chapter 1. That's everything that's there that I can give you now. Are there questions or comments on any of this that we've covered? Maybe things that, as we read through it and talked about it, that reminded you of something else that was said?